Ukraine's counter-offensive in the Donbass is gathering steam, and Russia's forces are in retreat in several areas which they earlier held. So this conflict, which has lasted 7 months so far, is at a critical stage. And Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has played a critical card this week. He's announced a partial mobilization for the Russian Defense Forces. Now, while most of the world's leaders were gathering in New York City for the United Nations General Assembly, Vladimir Putin went live on television from the Kremlin. It was an address to the Russian people. He said,
для защиты нашей Родины, ее суверенитета и территориальной целостности, для обеспечения безопасности нашего народа и людей на освобожденных территориях, считаю необходимым поддержать предложение Министерства обороны и Генерального штаба о проведении в Российской Федерации частичной мобилизации.
On Crux DeCode, what exactly does a partial mobilization mean? Will this move help Russia reverse its fortunes in the battlefields of Ukraine? Does Putin's announcement betray the sense of desperation in the Kremlin? And why did Putin stop short of a general mobilization and only announce a partial one? And could a general mobilization actually end up backfiring on the Kremlin? Vladimir Putin's speech came a day after another big move by Russia. The Russian-controlled regions in both eastern and southern parts of Ukraine announced major plans to hold referendums on becoming an integral part of the Russian mainland. Now, this means that huge new areas could be opened up for the Russian army to draw upon. Well, the rest of the world may look at it as an illegal act, but not quite the way the Kremlin sees it. The Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, in fact, had said that the plan is for 300,000 reservists to be mobilized. What's even more interesting is that Shoigu said, and I quote, "But that is not a one-time thing." So, is this therefore only the first wave of what is expected to be several mobilizations? Or will Vladimir Putin go from a partial mobilization to an all-out general mobilization? Will he be left with no choice? And if yes, will that really solve Russia's problems on the battlefield? Now, this war has reached a turning point, with Ukraine recently retaking swathes of occupied territory, particularly in the Donbass. Now, in theory, mobilization could swell the Russian army's ranks. But what about the actual military infrastructure on the ground? Now, the throngs of new troops who would be drafted in, they would lack instructors who can train them. They would not have units that can absorb them. They would certainly not have commanders who can lead them and non-commissioned officers who could mentor them. And most importantly, they will not have equipment which can give them useful combat power. One of the most immediate impacts of a formal mobilization, a general mobilization, would be Russia's conscript reserves. Now, according to a report in the Moscow Times, partial mobilization will basically target Russia's military reserves. These reserves were estimated to be about 2 million as of last year. Other individuals, including those who have specialized skills like doctors, also discharged military personnel, retired military personnel, those who've left the army anywhere between the age of 27 to 60, could also be conscripted into the armed forces. Those subject to conscription or potential conscription could also face serious consequences on their movements, including on their ability to leave the country. And here's more evidence that a larger general mobilization could just be an inevitable step away. Russia's parliament, the Duma, has just approved amendments to the country's criminal code regarding, among other things, desertion and surrender during periods of wartime, martial law, and mobilization. So the question then that needs to be asked is, will a general mobilization backfire on Russia? Now, here's the thing. A general mobilization will at best feed into Ukraine a lot of untrained, under-equipped, and poorly led men who are more likely than not who would rather surrender, desert, or be killed on the battlefield. In short, they are cannon fodder. The Russian army is clearly no longer waiting to train new recruits, at least to a standard where they can then send them to the battlefront. Reports say the trainees were getting as little as 30 days of training before being deployed on the battlefield. And now, amid Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kharkiv and Kherson, and most importantly in Donbass, Russia's troop shortage crisis is even more dire. In fact, according to Western estimates, Russian casualties, both dead and wounded, now could extend upwards of 80,000. The desperation in the Kremlin was apparent when a video of a Wagner Group leader recently drawing volunteers from Russian prisons, that video went viral. In fact, the Russian army could not even train millions of new recruits, even if it wanted to, because it cannot equip them, it cannot lead them. It is simple. The mass mobilization on infrastructure that the Soviet Union built during the Cold War no longer exists in modern-day Russia. It sounds a bit ironic, but the fact is that in order to execute mobilization in wartime, you need to maintain massive, excessive defense capacities in peacetime. The Soviet army, back in the day, maintained enormous excessive capacities just in case of war. But that era is long gone. The Russian army sold off all that excess capacity during the years following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And after losing 2,000 tanks and thousands of other armored vehicles in the first 7 months of this war, the army can no longer arm new troops, at least not with reasonably modern weapons. A full-scale mobilization would clog the army's depleted training bases with unwilling draftees. And that will not produce useful combat power, nor will it inspire fierce resistance in a populace that so far the Kremlin has managed to insulate from the worst effects of a losing war. So then the question is, who really would benefit if Putin calls for a general mobilization? Certainly not the millions of poorly trained Russian soldiers that they would be pouring into the battlefields of Ukraine. Could it help the Kremlin? Well, yes, certainly, because strongmen like Vladimir Putin cannot be seen as losing on the battlefield. They would rather die than lose on the battlefield. Case in point being Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. Will Putin meet that same fate, or will he be able to turn around this war from a pretty poor situation as it exists as of today? Well, therein lies how history may remember Vladimir Putin.